All right, so I want to welcome everybody back to Black American or African American Studies with me, The Forecast. And like always, I appreciate all of y'all and all the love and support that y'all show me doing all of this. And I encourage others to put together their own curriculum or whatever you think that we need to learn. I definitely support that. Maybe we can work together. And if you have any questions or you disagree or you feel like I should add something in here, feel free to let me know or ask questions or whatever you feel. Now, this is the 8th session, and if you missed any of the previous ones, I encourage you to go back and just watch through the whole thing. But last time we were talking about during their Revolutionary War and how a lot of black people responded to that, and it was responses from everything from writings like Phyllis Wheatley to militant responses to black people creating their own mutual aid societies to benefit themselves. But I did also mention how some black soldiers went to go fight with the British and some black soldiers stayed to fight with the Americans. So with this lesson, I kind of want to just focus on what happened with the black people that sided with the British and the black people that sided with the Americans and see if either side kept their word to black people. Now, after 8 years of war, it finally ended with what they called the Treaty of Paris. But pretty much Britain just agreed to recognize America as a separate nation, but they still agreed to stay allies so that they can trade with each other peacefully without having to pay extra and for military protection and stuff like that. But now remember, their war started because they didn't want to pay taxes, right, for more troops to go kill more Indians and take land. And a lot of the quote-unquote Americans were mad because Britain outlawed them colonizing certain lands to the west. So now America was free to colonize as much of the land as they wanted to, or that they were able to. But also during this treaty, parts of Florida was given back to the Spanish, which is going to come back into play a little bit later in future lessons. But the Spanish was able to get parts of Florida back during this treaty too. But now that the war was over, all of the black soldiers who sided with the British, which they call the Black Loyalists, but every black person that sided with the British was forced to leave America. And in New York, over 3,000 people alone were sent to places like Nova Scotia, Canada, and other British territories in Canada.
When the war was over and the British had lost, the British soldiers, collectively called Loyalists, left for Nova Scotia. 3,548 black Loyalists landed in Halifax between 1783 and 1784. Over half of the black Loyalists settled in Shelburne County, mainly settling in Birchtown, named for Samuel Birch, who signed their freedom papers. Each Loyalist was promised 100 acres of land, plus additional acreage for each family member. Unfortunately, with such a large influx of immigrants, the matter of receiving land was difficult. White Loyalists took precedence over their black counterparts. When black Loyalists did receive land, sometimes after waiting years, they received a significantly smaller amount of land than they were promised. Furthermore, the land they received was rocky and not suitable for crops. Most black Loyalists could not afford to have their land surveyed and therefore could not build on it. They had to dig holes to live in order to survive the winter months. Life for the black Loyalists was far from the promised land they envisioned. While the black Loyalists were free, there were still many enslaved Africans in Nova Scotia, and for the white citizens, there was no difference between a free black and an enslaved one. Furthermore, Birchtown was a haven for escaped slaves who could hide from their masters among free blacks. This upset white citizens who felt they were losing their property. Furthermore, black Loyalists were paid a quarter of the wages of a white man, and so employers were more likely to hire blacks as a source of cheap labor. This angered white citizens as they felt they were stealing their jobs. Those who could not find jobs were forced to become indentured servants. Some black Loyalists were even kidnapped and sold into slavery once again.
During Black History Month, Canadians might hear about the Black Loyalists, black soldiers who sided with the British during the American Revolution and found refuge here, settling in Nova Scotia. What we don't often hear about is how those loyalists faced terrible conditions and that many of them left Canada for greener pastures in Africa.
You look around and you don't see anything that says there were black loyalists that were here who got on board 15 ships and settled across the ocean. It's amazing. It's a story that needs to be told.
This is Wayne Hamilton's story, one of searching for his roots. 2 centuries ago, Hamilton's ancestors came to Nova Scotia in search of freedom.
My sense is that after 3 or 4 years, the black loyalists really were having a real tough time of it.
So hundreds of former slaves made another journey, this time to Africa.
Some families probably were separated because maybe the brother didn't want to go, but one brother did.
It was here in Birchtown black loyalists were promised land and settled. People here are working to preserve that story.
Once the largest settlement of liberated slaves outside of Africa, an unyielding coast where families were separated.
If you look around at the landscape outside, it's very rocky, and one would imagine how it did anybody scrape an existence between those rocks.
Inside this small museum is a copy of the famed Book of Negroes. Within it, the names of slaves who escaped to Canada, free but on unforgiving land. Many chose to leave, this time for Africa's shores.
Now, even though they say the British supposedly kept their word, of course they didn't. And most of the land and the supplies went to white people first. White people only, really. And the few black people who did get land, they got the worst land, the worst supplies. And of course, they still face the same treatment that free black people in America was already facing before their quote-unquote revolution. And the thing is, a lot of the white loyalists were able to bring their own slaves with them to the same areas. So the British actually accommodated white slave owners more so than the black loyalists who helped them fight the war. And you already know many of the white people in these places didn't see any differences between us Negroes. Only we see differences between us. But other groups don't see differences between us. They didn't care if you was free or enslaved. They treated us all the same. And by this point, most enslaved people was just running away anyway, right? And just blending in into black communities. And of course, black people was, even in those situations, helping each other get freedom. Now, another thing that was pissing the white loyalists and the white people up in Nova Scotia and Canada and the places where black people went was that black people were the more skilled laborers. And not only that, companies or employers would only pay them half or a quarter of what they paid white workers. So not only were they getting better laborers, they were getting it at a cheaper price. And there was no way for these poor white people to compete for jobs, which made them more angry at the black community. And of course, they start randomly attacking black people, right? They would face violence. And in a lot of cases, they started kidnapping black people, especially kidnapping children, and selling them back into slavery, not only to make a profit, but just out of pure hatred for black people. And this was happening so much that it became a business. And as we go on throughout the lessons, we'll see this business practice of them kidnapping and stealing, especially black children. And how some of the laws, like the law even George Washington passed, right? The Fugitive Slave Act. But, hopefully we'll talk about that on the next one. But as the kidnappings increased and the violence increased, it eventually led to a full-blown race riot in 1784 known as the Shelburne Riots.
David George, a black loyalist and Baptist preacher, founded a church in Shelburne shortly following his arrival in Nova Scotia. He attracted both white and black churchgoers. Tension started to grow when George began baptizing white citizens and came to a head when he baptized a white woman. On July 26, 1784, 40 disbanded white loyalists tore down George's home and about 20 homes of black loyalists in the area. The Shelburne Riot is considered the first race riot in North America. George continued to preach, but the white loyalists returned and beat him with sticks, chasing him into a swamp. The rioting continued for 10 days, with trips into the black communities lasting into August when soldiers were dispatched to deal with the issue. As a result, a dusk to dawn curfew was issued for all black citizens, and the black loyalists were now completely left out of land deals. The victims of the Shelburne riot were being punished.
Now, even though they try to give this credit for being the first full-blown race riot in North America, and that was in Canada, we have seen several already, so we know that this is not the first. But the Shelburne riot started because a popular black preacher named David George, who led a church and preached to mostly black people, but there was some white people as well. And many white people already felt that a black person shouldn't be preaching to white people. But when this brother David George had the nerve to baptize a white woman, they were pissed. Think about that. They try to act like Canada is something different. The first race riot, according to them, in Canada started because a black preacher baptized a white woman. And most of the white dudes were angry. And the first thing they did was resort to violence against this preacher baptizing somebody. That same day, a lynch mob burned down David George's house along with 20 other black homes. And that was just on the first night. And for the next 10 days, mobs continued to destroy, loot, and burn black homes and destroy our property. Now, even though there's no official record saying that anybody was killed, the actual number of people who were probably murdered is unknown, right? Many people believe that many people were murdered, right? Countless people were injured. And by the time it was over, all but a few black people ended up leaving town except for the people who were servants and slaves. And the few black people who chose to stay for whatever reason, they were treated worse than before and were most likely treated no different than the slaves that were still there. Now, most of the black people that left Nova Scotia and Shelburne ended up going to Sierra Leone after Freetown was established there in 1787 by 400 former slaves who had been sent from London over there.
In 1787, English ships sailed towards Sierra Leone. Aboard were 380 freed slaves, ready to start a new life in modern-day Freetown. This proved to be the start of a disastrous experiment. We'll hear why in a bit. They were newcomers to Africa, despite, ironically, their forefathers having been transported as slaves across the Atlantic. This group of freed slaves were the first group of Africans to be sailing in the opposite direction. Where they landed, they found native Africans that had settled there more than 6 centuries ago. They were probably the ancestors of Sierra Leone. These people were the Limbas, the oldest ethnic group in Sierra Leone, the coastal Burlom, Tine, and the Mande-speaking people including Vai, Loko, and Mende. So, when the newly freed slaves arrived, abolitionists who had freed them had to negotiate with local chiefs about their resettlement. Disputes over the territory emerged shortly after. Additionally, not long after that, that first group of resettled slaves sadly died from disease and hunger. Later, in 1792, the experiment was tried again. Nearly 1,200 black loyalists, that's African Americans who served the British Army in the American Revolution, and they were living in London in difficult conditions, traveled across the Atlantic to settle in Freetown. Then, a third group of freed slaves, the Maroons, traveled to Sierra Leone colony from Jamaica in 1800. By the late 19th century, the new settlers were becoming part of the Creole ethnicity, often called Creole in modern-day Freetown.
Now, the settlement was originally called Granville, but after they had issues with local African tribes in the area and then with diseases, it ended up failing, and they had to abandon the settlement. But in 1792, the British sent 1,100 black loyalists back to Sierra Leone, and they officially established Freetown. Now, there were some issues. They tried to work together with tribes who had already been in the area. But, it was constant divisions and tribalism. But many black families did leave America, go to Nova Scotia, right, or Canada, and ended up in Sierra Leone or different parts of Africa, right? Now, as far as the black soldiers that sided with the Americans, right, they got screwed over too. They didn't fare that much better. Now, even though during the war, they said they were offering freedom to anyone who helped them fight, after it was over, places like Connecticut and Rhode Island passed gradual emancipation laws. They tried to make it seem like, you come fight, you do well, you're free. But no, now what they're saying is, we'll gradually emancipate you. And even then, the law only applied to children who were born after 1784. And even those children would not be free until the women turned 21 and the men turned 25. Right? And I think some places it was 18 for women and 21 for men. So pretty much gradual emancipation means you're going to be a slave your entire childhood. And the crazy part is Rhode Island supposedly had banned slavery in 1652. And you know what? Most of the wealthy, rich white families in Rhode Island were heavily involved in the slave trade, including the Brown family that the Ivy League school is named after, Brown University, which was started by this white dude named Nicholas Brown and his brother or something like that.
It was 15 years ago that Brown University first released its landmark Slavery and Justice Report, which documented how the school's founder and others who helped build up the school profited from the slave trade. It laid out recommendations for the university to move forward from its past and also started conversations at higher education institutes across the nation about their complicated histories with race and slavery. Now, 15 years later, Brown is releasing a follow-up report with new insights into the original findings and new assessments as to how far the university's come and how far it has to go to address and make up for its past.
Now, all of these colonial colleges were built by slaves and were funded by the slave trade, including Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Dartmouth, William and Mary, Columbia, Rutgers, and the University of Pennsylvania. And some of these colleges were even started on plantations.
Did you know that the Ivy League has profited off of the slave trade for a long time? Let's talk about it. Let's start with Brown. So Brown was named after the Brown brothers, who gave a lot of money to the university. Two of these brothers traded enslaved people, and one of them ran a factory. The University Hall at Brown was built in part by labor of enslaved people. Also, at least 30 members of Brown's governing board also owned slave ships. Now let's talk about the fucked up shit that happened at Dartmouth. Yeah, this is dark. So, the founder of Dartmouth, he actually used the bodies of enslaved people as experimental tools at the university. He would literally boil enslaved people's bodies in order to separate the skeleton and then wire it up to be used in classrooms. Yale isn't out of this either. Yale used a lot of money from trading enslaved people, and this was used to build their library, to hire professors, and to give out scholarships. Princeton would recruit students from rich families that owned enslaved people. In the 1700s, literally the majority of students at Princeton were the sons of slave owners or traders. And Princeton was not the only university that did this. There was also Harvard, Yale, Columbia, Rutgers, Brown, Dartmouth, and the University of Delaware. Let me go to my notes for this part. So Princeton's first 9 university presidents from 1747 to 1854 owned enslaved people, and many of them during their time as president. Also, many of the professors at Princeton owned enslaved people. So in 1776, there was enslaved people in the possession of Samuel Finley, and he was the Princeton president at the time. And when he died, these enslaved people in his possession were literally auctioned off on campus for an entire fucking month. And Rutgers isn't any different. Rutgers' first president, Jacob Hardenberg, he had ownership of Sojourner Truth, the same Sojourner Truth. Rutgers also had the defense of enslavement inside their curriculum. They basically used this curriculum to provide flawed justification for the free labor of black people, the absolute power of slave owners, and the separation of races.
So now, after the war was over, right, a lot of America's focus was on colonizing more land to the west. And even though North Carolina passed laws against importing slaves into their state, right, and that's from other states or wherever, but even though North Carolina passed that law, there was starting to be a debate about whether slavery should be allowed in these new territories they're about to go conquer or not. Now, like I told you last time, you could tell a lot about a group of people about who they choose to be their leaders, right? And they chose a pedophile rapist, like Thomas Jefferson, to create their land ordinance of 1784. Now, Congress rejected Thomas Jefferson ordinance because it banned slavery in the new territories after 1800. Now, even though you might hear some other people refer to Thomas Jefferson as some abolitionist who spoke against slavery, right? Good old TJ. But him speaking against slavery was not for some moralistic reason, right? He had slaves and didn't even get rid of his own. But like I told you last time with Benjamin Franklin, a lot of that stuff comes from white nationalist talking points because they wanted to be a white and tawny, aka red Indian nation. And they felt that the Negro should not be here, which is funny because they never released their own slaves. So, we already know about the hypocrisy with them though. Now, Thomas Jefferson said Negroes are inferior, and he only supported abolishing slavery if Negroes were educated and assimilated into white society. But he also thought that we were mentally incapable of being educated. So we don't even meet his mark to abolish slavery. In a letter to Patrick Henry, he said, Negroes were so far mentally inferior, we're incapable of producing a single poet. Right? And he constantly took shots at Phyllis Wheatley, a black woman who proved them wrong.
We're going to read as Thomas Jefferson tells us about the Negro slave in the early American colonies, particularly in the state of Virginia. And I begin. It will probably be asked, why not retain and incorporate the blacks into the state, and thus save the expense of supplying by importation of white settlers the vacancies they will leave? Deep-rooted prejudices entertained by the whites, 10,000 recollections by the blacks of the injuries they have sustained, new provocations, the real distinctions which nature has made, and many other circumstances will divide us into parties and produce convulsions which will probably never end but in the extermination of one or the other race. To these objections, which are political, may be added others, which are physical and moral. The first difference which strikes us is that of color. Whether the black of the Negro resides in the reticular membrane between the skin and the scarf skin, or in the scarf skin itself, whether it proceeds from the color of the blood, the color of the bile, or from that of some other secretion, the difference is fixed in nature and is as real as if its seat and cause were better known to us. And is this difference of no importance? Is it not the foundation of a greater or less share of beauty in the two races? Are not the fine mixtures of red and white the expressions of every passion by greater or less effusions of color in the one, preferable to that eternal monotony which reigns in the countenances, that immovable veil of black which covers the emotions of the other race? Add to these flowing hair, a more elegant symmetry of form, their own judgment in favor of the whites, declared by their preference of them, as uniformly as is the preference of the orangutan for the black woman over those of his own species. The circumstance of superior beauty is thought worthy of attention in the propagation of our horses, dogs, and other domestic animals. Why not in that of man? They, the blacks, have less hair on the face and body, They secrete less by the kidneys and are more by the glands of the skin, which gives them a very strong and disagreeable odor. This greater degree of transpiration renders them more tolerant of heat and less so of cold than the whites. They, that is, the blacks, seem to require less sleep. A black, after hard labor through the day, will be induced by the slightest amusements to sit up until midnight or later, though knowing he must be out with the first dawn of the morning. This may perhaps proceed from a want of forethought which prevents their seeing a danger till it be present. When present, they do not go through it with more coolness or steadiness than the whites. They, the blacks, are more ardent after their female, but love seems with them to be more an eager desire than a tender, delicate mixture of sentiment and sensation. Their griefs are transient, those numberless afflictions which render it doubtful whether heaven has given life to us in mercy or in wrath, are less felt and sooner forgotten with them. In general, their existence appears to participate more of sensation than reflection. In reason, much inferior, as I think one could scarcely be found capable of tracing and comprehending the investigations of Euclid. And in imagination, they are dull, tasteless, and anomalous. It would be unfair to follow them to Africa for this investigation. We will consider them here, on the same stage with the whites. It will be right to make great allowances for the difference of condition, of education, of conversation, of the sphere in which they move. Many millions of them have been brought to and born in America. Most of them, indeed, have been confined to tillage, to their own homes, and to their own society. But never yet could I find that a black had uttered a thought above the level of plain narration, never saw even an elementary trait of painting or sculpture. In music, they are more generally gifted than the whites, with accurate ears for tune and time, and they have been found capable of imagining a small catch. Whether they will be equal to the composition of a more extensive run of melody or of complicated harmony is yet to be proved. Misery is often the parent of the most affecting touches in poetry. Among the blacks is misery enough, God knows, but no poetry. I advance it, therefore, as a suspicion only that the blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to the whites in the endowments both of body and mind. This unfortunate difference of color and perhaps of faculty is a powerful obstacle in the emancipation of these people.
Now, let's be real. Some of y'all feel like Phyllis Wheatley couldn't have existed because it was a black woman who could be a poet, right? But anyway, not all places were even talking about this quote-unquote gradual assimilation. In New York, they kind of doubled down on slave laws. One law required Negroes and mulatto slaves to carry lanterns if they were out at night. You know, they try to be like, oh, Negroes do crime at night. But, you know, they often weren't allowed to be out unless given permission. But New York even outlawed riding horses in what they called a disorderly fashion. I don't know how you ride a horse in a disorderly fashion or not. I guess they talking about like that scene from Django, you know, who's this N-word up on his nag kind of thing. But they outlawed pretty much black people being able to ride horses, right? Fishing was even outlawed. And of course, slaves could only have funerals for their loved ones during the daytime, right? Because a lot of them felt like they used funerals as a place to organize and plan rebellions, right? But even with all this, the free black population in New York still created the New York African Society in 1784. And like I said, you know, black people had to create these mutual aid societies to help each other, because nobody else was going to help them, no matter where they were in the world. And the crazy thing is, the next year, in 1785, a slave owner who they call a founding father, John Jay, founded the New York Manumission Society.
One of the central figures is John Jay, with whom most of this audience is quite familiar as our inaugural Chief Justice, author of some of the Federalist Papers, and a principal figure in the early foreign policy of the United States. Many of you are perhaps less familiar with his role as the enslaver of men, women, and children, and paradoxically, as the inaugural president of one of the world's first anti-slavery societies, the New York Manumission Society, and governor of New York when that state passed its landmark gradual emancipation law in 1799.
Now, they try to put it in a way like the duality of John Jay. You know, I say the hypocrisy of him. Because no matter what he said, he continued to be a slave owner. He never got rid of his slaves either. And he constantly debated about whether, even if freed, whether Negroes should have rights or not. Right? Because you have to understand about these abolitionists, right? They felt like we were inferior, not that we should govern ourselves. Most of them wanted a white nation. Some people did say slavery was bad, but these Negroes are mentally inferior and we have to assimilate them into our society and teach them. This is the two sides to the coin. These are your abolitionists. As many of them, although they may have been against slavery, they didn't think that Negroes should have rights because we were incapable mentally of doing anything. But in 1785, this dude, John Jay, proposed a bill to end slavery in New York eventually, but it was rejected. Now, Virginia in 1785 ended up passing legislation to classify mulatto or mixed people as Negro. And pretty much they said anyone with at least 1/4 Negro blood or at least one black grandparent was considered a Negro. So you could have 3 white grandparents and 1 black grandparent, and they would consider you a Negro. Now, although this wasn't the official one-drop rule, this is kind of like the birth of the one-drop rule concept, which we'll see start to develop in laws as we go along. Now, when it came time to honor their word to black soldiers who helped them fight in the war, Virginia only passed a bill to extend the rights for white residents and went out of the way to exclude black people. And when the bill did mention black people, it said no person henceforth shall be a slave except those already enslaved and their descendants. Now, I don't know if you understand what that means, because they were talking about offering freedom, but now they're saying, well, anyone born after this who isn't a slave right now won't be a slave. But if you're a slave today, right now, then you're going to be a slave forever and your descendants. And that law didn't free anybody. And in fact, Virginia passed stricter slave codes than before. Right now, slaves were required to have a pass or a license when they left the plantation. And if anybody got caught trying to run away, white people were deputized and were required to take action to capture them. And when they returned them to the owner, then the owner had to reward the person that returned them. Now, if nobody claimed the person who was taken or arrested, then they would be leased out to work for the state. Now, the state had to put an ad in the paper about the runaway slave in the lost slave section. And if nobody claimed them after a year, then they could be sold off for profit by the state. Now, understand this, right? Because we're going to talk about this a little bit more with the fugitive slave law, like I mentioned earlier. There were a lot of free black people, especially children, being kidnapped. And they're saying, if you don't have a pass, if you don't have this to prove this, that you're free, and nobody claims you as their slave, not only are we going to put you to slave labor for at least a year, after we're done, or whenever we feel like it, we're going to sell you. Just as long as we put an ad in the lost slave paper, right? Now, before, in some cases, slaves could even go find work on their own as long as they gave a portion or most of their earnings to their quote-unquote master. But at this point, Virginia even put an end to that. And even if somebody was out looking for work with permission, they would be arrested, right? They often call black people just out on the streets, minding their business, wandering slaves. They could be legally kidnapped by local law enforcement and be sold off. But anyway, now that slavery was supposedly gradually ending in the North, right, the 14th colony, which is Vermont, ended up banning slave trading across state lines, right? Sort of like North Carolina. Now, like I said, I don't want this one to be that long because I want to focus on a specific section, and we'll get more into detail as we go along. But I just kind of wanted to see the results of, the black soldiers who sided with the British and the black soldiers who sided with America. And there's one more thing I want to get into with this lesson, because while the Revolutionary War still does have an effect on the revolution black people are now willing to take, a lot of the next part gets into what they call the beginning of their nation. So that'll be more in the next lesson. But I do want to touch on, while they were in their quote-unquote constitutional convention in Pennsylvania, two powerful black men, Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, was busy creating their own organization.
Richard Allen is the founder of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, a gentleman who himself, having been a slave, earned or worked for his freedom out of slavery, and as a result of that, was able to accomplish quite a bit in life in general, a model for many people of what it means to advance and to move forward, but also to do it against great odds and obstacles. In that time period, Philadelphia itself was a bustling type of city that was growing and developing economically. I believe that Allen and his folks were keenly aware of opportunities. Richard Allen believed that African Americans could be a viable citizens in their city, that they should be considered, of course, as equal. He used his faith in God and the scriptures to promote that and to sustain his argument.
I think of black reform in the early national period. Absalom Jones is one of the great heroes of both of these things. And yet, I think his personality is such that he is going to constantly take a back seat to Richard Allen and to other African American leaders. He's a little older than Allen. He's by nature a little more unassuming, gentle, quiet. He is someone who waits patiently to gain his freedom. He makes sure others get their freedom first. He is someone who counsels moderation. He will strike for freedom, for liberty when the timing is right, but not before then. And I think he and Allen form this great duo. They're somewhat like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Thomas Jefferson's the Hotspur, James Madison's the thinker. So Richard Allen is the firebrand, and Absalom Jones is the counselor, the person who steps back.
Now, when Richard Allen, who was more of the fiery speaker and leader, met Absalom Jones, who was a little bit more reserved and quiet, they became good friends. And they both agreed that something had to happen and that, black people needed to create their own. And after they experienced racism and, the white church trying to segregate them, they decided enough was enough and they wanted to create their own church.
Richard Allen is an American hero.
He was a pioneer, and he blazed a trail for future generations to follow.
He was the first African American leader to lead through nonviolence.
Richard Allen was born in 1760, a slave to Benjamin Chew of Philadelphia. When he was 7 years old, Chew separated Allen from his family and sold him to Stokely Sturgis in Delaware.
When he meets these Methodist ministers who are, going through Delaware and preaching the gospel, and his life is converted, he's literally changed.
The explanation of scriptures helped inform his understanding of who he was as a man. God certainly didn't make him to be bound.
When he was 26, Allen and his brother purchased their freedom, agreeing to pay $2,000 over 5 years, and then to Philadelphia, where he became the early morning preacher at St. George's United Methodist Church.
The Methodist Church was still very equal in the way that it treated everyone. It was not uncommon to find a black slave, for example, preaching to white slave owners.
His presence and message brought in many new members. As Allen's following grew, white church leaders began segregating African Americans in the balcony during services.
He marches to the pews that he thinks he belongs in, and one of the white leaders starts walking down the aisle to where Absalom Jones, the senior member of the black community, is praying on his knees, and he says, "Get up, get up. You go to the back of the church. You don't belong here." And Allen is watching this from the side. If he tells Absalom Jones to get up and white parishioners don't stop him, we leave. If he tells Absalom Jones to get up and white parishioners say, "Sit down, he's equal," we stay.
But the white parishioners were silent, and Allen and Jones led the black congregation out of St. George's.
Walking out of St. George's Church is the beginning of civil rights movements in American society.
That was really the moment that Allen wanted and had been waiting for.
Now, eventually, they created the Free African Society in Philadelphia, not only to provide a place of worship for black people, but also to provide financial support for their members, right? And just in the black community as a whole, because they didn't just help only people with them, they tried to help everybody. Now, the members in these groups put their money together to help the black community from everything from starting businesses to creating schools to providing aid for the sick or to help people bury their loved ones, and just something to help provide aid for other black people.
Too often the focus is on the problems, pain, and pathos found in African American history. Discovering truth, revealing little-known realities, and surprising stories can offer inspiration and instruction, even in the world of healthcare insurance and other forms of financial self-sufficiency.
You've heard before how we couldn't get pork chops, so we made chitlins a delicacy. Well, in the same vein, we had African American leaders, primarily coming out of our religious community, ministers like Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, who at the end of the 18th century, while we were still struggling with slavery and disconnects of all sorts, created, out of their religious fervor, mutual aid societies.
Richard Allen, along with a number of other black Methodist bodies that came together, formed the African Methodist Episcopal Church and incorporated, had our first general conference in 1816. The AME Church, initially started from what we like to consider as the first sit-in Philadelphia in 1787, led by Richard Allen, Absalom Jones, and some worshipers at St. George's Methodist Episcopal Church, where they were not welcome to worship freely. After they completed their prayer, they walked out. And they started the Free African Society, which was a benevolent society that was really focused on caring for those that really were having trouble caring for themselves.
The Free African Society's Articles of Incorporation, written in the spring of 1787, call out a concern with health and wellness that resonates across the centuries as they stated, "A society should be formed without regard to religious tenets, provided the persons lived an orderly and sober life, in order to support one another in sickness and for the benefit of their widows and fatherless children."
African Americans pool their funds that we might be able to bury our dead, that we might be able to take care of the widows, that we might be able to provide some health care for the youth.
We can find mutual aid societies providing protection, providing funds for food, for education, libraries, homes that were founded for orphans of color who had nowhere to go, who couldn't be part of orphanages that served white people. All of these sorts of things, as at the same time they were fighting against slavery.
From the very beginning, I mean, the black church was everything to the African American. I mean, it was a place where we did our theology, of course, and our politics. It was our conservatory of music. It was everything for the African American family and the African American child. The holistic kind of philosophy that undergirds the black church comes out of our kind of collective struggle. And so we have to address and have had to address these kinds of issues collectively for some time.
Well, it's an important model because at the time, there was no insurance for black folks.
These historic works of these heroes evolved from mutual aid societies to, as we move further down the line, African American insurance companies. The Atlanta Lifes, the Golden State Mutuals, the Supreme Life Insurances, the North Carolina Mutuals.
A multi-million-dollar enterprise operated solely by and for Negroes. Inside the home office this morning, switchboard operators, clerks, stenographers, bookkeepers, and secretaries prepare for a routine day's work with their usual composed dignity.
These came as responses of a community that was left out, that decided it needed to take care of itself.
Now, like we saw on the last lesson and we'll see on future lessons, a lot of these black mutual aid societies were popping up all over the place because we understood that we are all we got, and if nobody came to help us, then we would get no help. And they realized that they had to do what they had to do for themselves. And after they created their own individual mutual aid societies, they work with other societies in different areas. Like the brothers in Boston or the brothers in Rhode Island, like we talked about, worked with the brothers in Philadelphia. And like I said, next time we'll talk a little bit more about the AME Church. But black people knew that they had no choice, because while George Washington and them was having their convention to discuss the quote-unquote Negro problem, they also feared white uprisings because they never treated their own justly anyway. For example, one of their original January 6 riots was known as Shays' Rebellion.
The Revolutionary War left American states in debt. To raise money, legislators raised taxes. This angered poor farmers and war veterans to the point where they formed a rebellion and almost caused a civil war in Massachusetts. Daniel Shays, a former captain in the Continental Army, led the protest, which came to be known as Shays' Rebellion. In the summer of 1786, several thousand of Shays' followers prevented tax collection and used force to keep debtors out of prison. They headed to Springfield to seize weapons, intending to force the Boston legislature to change the law. Massachusetts residents were terrified. The legislature realized it was powerless. The Continental Army had been disbanded after the Revolutionary War, and the federal government had no money for new troops. Finally, wealthy merchants in Boston agreed to raise an army of over 4,000 militia to fight Shays' men.
These men were talking about forming a new country out there. There's no telling what might have happened. If Shays' Rebellion had flourished, if these guys had been able to grab all those guns and had arsenal and armed a big army, it would have been a very bad thing for the country.
Now, I won't get into the white-on-white crime thing, but, it's funny. Right after rebelling because of having to pay taxes, now they wanted to do the same thing to the poor white people in America, which pissed them off. And even though people like Samuel Adams, who just 10 years earlier was one of the most famous rebels, now all of a sudden he was in power, he was completely against the rebels and felt they should be put to death. But like I said, man, I'm not going to get into that white-on-white crime. Y'all can study American history for that. All right, but we're going to end our lesson here. Even though there's a few more things that I want to mention, but, like I said, I want to just go with the timeline, and go through the history, because there's other events that was influenced by the Revolutionary War, and black people was ready to pick up the guns after being influenced and using their logic against them. Right? And we'll come to that. We'll get to that eventually. But I just wanted to look at this particular section and the response, the reaction of the black loyalists and the black people who stay loyal to America, and see who fared better, if anybody did at all, or if it was just the same thing. Right? So I appreciate all of y'all for listening. I appreciate all of y'all for y'all support. I encourage everybody to put together some kind of course, for our children to help them, and especially give them the right mindset, whether it be business, investing, chemistry, science, math, history, no matter what it may be, ancient history or whatever it may be. And if you got any questions, feel free to ask, or any comments, feel free to let me know. Or if there's anything I missed, please let me know. So again, thank y'all, and I appreciate y'all, and I'll see you again on the next lesson. And as always, man, we have got to start standing for something, or we're going to keep falling for anything.